Welcome to session 2 of project management. In this session we're going to realise that projects are all about leadership and management.
In session 2, this session, we're going to develop the idea that in order to be an effective project manager, you also have to be an effective project leader. The world of project management has shifted from just a focus on planning and control towards the whole human aspect and how the project leader and manager can actually get the best out of his or her people. Moving on to slide 2. Let's look at the project manager role, and in particular let's look at the 3 aspects of the project manager role. And those 3 aspects are understanding what that role is, the role of the project manager and leader. Secondly, understanding the concept of organisational team working. And thirdly, understanding the project life cycle of definition, planning, resourcing, implementation and handover. Now, running a project effectively does involve both management and leadership. And there are 3 main aspects to the role of the project manager and leader, as we've already seen. Firstly, and let's explore these in a bit more detail, the person running the project has to understand the role of the project leader and manager. This role involves, as we've said, both leadership and management, and as we'll see in later slides, communication plays an important part in the role of effective project management and leadership. The person running the project needs to look up and down the organisational hierarchy, be aware of historical events, and at the same time give consideration to possible future events, and manage relationships outside the project as well as internal team issues. Promoting organisational team working is important, and this involves both the visible and invisible teams as well as the stakeholders. Organisational politics can hamper greatly the activities of a project team, so attention to the issue of organisational team working is vitally important. What we mean by organisational team working is the whole organisation pulling together to be supportive for the project. And we'll present a framework for promoting organisational team working in a later slide. The project life cycle is an important issue to which the project leader needs to pay attention. Every project goes through the same phases of definition, planning, resourcing, implementation and handover, and we'll deal with these issues as the sessions progress. In the meantime, you can find out more about the role of the project leader and manager in the book Project Leadership by Briner, Geddes and Hastings, and this is listed in the bibliography. Now, before moving on to the next slide, give some thought to the study questions. Firstly, how well do you understand your role as a project manager and leader? What do you understand by the team or the term organisational team working? How closely does the project life cycle of definition, planning, resourcing, implementation and handover fit with any of the projects in which you are currently engaged? So moving on to slide 3, let's think what project managers actually do. Project leaders and managers are responsible for the achievement of project goals which are specific and which require visible and dynamic activity. And as we've already said, project leaders and managers need to look upwards, outwards, backwards, forwards, downwards and inwards. So let's explore what project managers actually do and how they tend to operate. The project leader often works outside day-to-day business activities and thus may be outside the normal organisational hierarchy. There are often unusual and temporary links to senior managers, and there are few formal rules on how project managers should behave in this somewhat ambiguous environment. It's important that the project manager creates and develops informal lines of communication throughout the organisation if they are to develop sufficient influence to be effective. The project leader and manager is responsible for the achievement of project goals which are specific and which require visible and dynamic activity. Project managers and leaders have to look upwards, outwards, backwards, forwards, downwards and inwards to be successful. And we will use a questionnaire later in this module in one of the sessions so that you can assess how well you perform according to this approach to the project leader and manager's role. Now, before moving on to the next slide, give some thought to the study questions. Would you describe yourself as a project manager or a project leader or both? What evidence can you present to support your view of your operation? Before undertaking the questionnaire later, think about how effective you are at the 6 areas of looking upwards, outwards and backwards, forwards, downwards and inwards, to which the project manager and leader should pay attention. Moving on to slide 4, the project leader's new work, developing organisational team working. Let's look for a moment at this concept of organisational team working. We'll look at the nature of the project team, how you create a shared view of success, working out the team codes of conduct, keeping in touch with team members, enabling everybody to contribute, having realistic targets, reviewing progress and managing those external relationships. Our project teams tend to have characteristics which set them apart from any other types of team. The project team is often brought together for a specific project. Its members are seldom full-time and do not usually form a hierarchy within the team. And the teams invariably cross-functional in nature and will include both visible and invisible team members. To ensure that the team works effectively both within itself and within the context of the organisation, there are a number of factors which are important. Firstly, it is important to establish a shared view of success. What does success mean as far as this project team is concerned? There needs to be an agreed code of conduct for working together. The leader must keep in touch with the various team members when they are apart and ensure that each individual team member is able to contribute and made to feel important as regards those contributions. Leadership of the team, particularly if it's dispersed and part-time, is very important, and one way to achieve this is by setting realistic targets, milestones and reporting times. It's important to review constantly the progress and performance of the project and its team, and finally the external relationships. Those relationships with the all-important stakeholders need to be managed effectively. Now, before moving on to the next slide, give some thought to the study questions. How would you describe your project team in terms of full or part-time, focusing on a specific project, cross-functional, and its hierarchical nature, including both visible and invisible members? How does your team shape up to the criteria in the slide? How effective have you been at establishing the shared view of success criteria, setting up a code of conduct for working together, keeping in touch with dispersed members, unlocking the potential contribution of individual team members, setting realistic targets, reviewing progress, and managing external relationships? In slide 5, we move on to have a look at the project life cycle. We're going to talk about project definition, planning, implementation, handing over and winding up of the project. Well, an aspect of project working which makes the work different from normal operations is that the project has a start, a middle and an end. Operational management, on the other hand, tends to be ongoing and continuous. Thus we talk about the project life cycle, and that life cycle tends to have a number of distinct phases. Firstly, there is the definition stage, where the strategic fit of the project is identified, specifications created, and the various stakeholders become involved. Once that initial project definition phase is completed, then the planning and resourcing stage takes place. This leads to the implementation phase, where the bulk of the project work is undertaken in practical development terms. Finally, it's usual for handing over to a client, and this handing over stage takes place so that the project can be wound up. This final phase can have significant implications for the morale and the human side of the project team if it's not handled in an appropriate and sensitive manner. So let's think about some study questions that this probably raises in your mind. Firstly, how well defined is your project life cycle in any project in which you're currently involved? Is the project definition clear and concise? And has the planning been carried out with reference to resource issues effectively? How is the implementation phase proceedings, and what plans do you have for the handing over of the project to the end users? Just give some thought to those questions before moving on to the next slide. Let's move on to slide 6 and consider the leadership management debate. Is leadership the same as management? Well, in the 1990s, much discussion took place about the differences between what we understand by leadership and what we understand by management. The feeling was that many of our organisations were strongly managed, but weakly led. The pendulum then swung the other way, and a much greater emphasis was placed on leadership development than on management development. It was clearly identified that although leadership and management are related, they are not the same processes. Both are equally important. One approach was that leadership and management are like two overlapping circles. A number of writers, including Warren Bennis, then separated those circles to see what each contained. The next two slides show how Warren Bennis identified some of the possible differences between leadership activity and management activity. All are relevant to project working. But before we move on to those slides, just give some thought to the following two study questions. Now, we've already raised this topic about whether you think you're a project leader or project manager. It's time to revisit it. Would you describe yourself as a project leader or a project manager? What steps can you take to develop your skills both as a project manager and a project leader? Let's move on to slide 7. The differentiation between leadership and management in our two circles diagram can be effectively explored using the leadership management debate which Warren Bennis proposed. The idea, as we've already said, is that an executive position, both in terms of leadership and management, the management functions and the leadership functions appear as two overlapping circles. Now, by pulling the circles apart, it's interesting to see what the leader circle contains and what the manager circle contains. Now, whilst Bennis has his critics with regards to this approach, the distinctions between what might be classed management and what might be classed leadership provide a useful insight for our typology of leadership problems, which we'll be dealing with later. The leader column contains things like the leader innovates, is an original, tends to develop people and system, but tends to focus on people, inspires trust, tends to take the longer range view, perhaps with thoughts on main beam, to use a motoring analogy, and tends to ask what and why. The manager, on the other hand, tends to protect the status quo by administering things, is often a copy, a fit into the organisation, tends to maintain rather than develop things, focuses mainly on systems rather than people, relies on control, tends to have a short range view, often a firefighting view, and tends to ask how and when. So let's turn to our study questions. Do you think it's useful to separate leadership and management in this way? Do these lists tend to favour leadership as being more important than management? Which of these elements are particularly relevant to project working? So just give some thought to those before looking at Bennis's second list of differences between the leader and the manager. In slide 8, we look at a continuation of some of Bennis's other thoughts on the differences between the leader and the manager. And this next slide, slide 8, continues this leadership debate in a similar theme. However, In this slide, a particularly interesting distinction occurs in that Bennis argues that managers can be trained to be managers, but leaders have to learn how to lead, and that is a more complex process. If we just look for a moment and talk through the leader column, the leader has an eye on the horizon, originates, challenges the status quo, obeys and thinks and does the right things, and as we've already said, tends to learn rather than to be trained to be a leader. The manager, on the other hand, has the eye on the bottom line, often tends to imitate to maintain the culture of the organisation, tends to accept the status quo, often obeys orders without question, does things right, and, as Bennis has suggested, can be trained. So this list does perhaps place a slightly more positive spin on the leader role rather than the manager role. The important thing is that both of these are important when it comes to project management and leadership. So let's look at our study questions. Can you add to this list of distinctions between leadership and management in terms of the projects in which you are involved? Do you feel that you spend more time on the leadership aspects or the management aspects, and do you think you're really balanced in the way that you run any projects in which you're involved? Finally, do you think that leadership is primarily an emotionally based process rather than an intellectually based one? Give some thought to those study questions before moving on to the next slide. Slide 9. Another prolific writer on leadership is Professor John Kotter of the Harvard Business School in the USA. Kotter focuses on the processes created by the leader and the manager rather than the individual themselves. Planning, organising, controlling and predictability are important project management processes. Setting overall direction, aligning the team in emotional focus terms, inspiring them to go the extra mile, and encouraging a healthy attitude to change are significant elements of project leadership. Once again, we see that the balance needs to be created by combining both leadership and management effort. So, think about the study questions. To which of the two columns in the slide do you pay most attention in your operation as a project manager and leader? Can you identify 3 issues in either column or both, which, if you made improvements in those areas, would make a major impact on your effectiveness as a project leader and manager? Now in slide 10 we pull things together and we identify 10 core leadership capabilities particularly relevant for the project leader. In 1997, my colleague Alan Hooper and I created our set of 7 core leadership capabilities. These included setting direction, communicating effectively, aligning people in emotional terms, bringing out the best in people by developing them, acting as a change agent, setting a good example, and handling crises and ambiguity effectively. In this slide, we've taken this baseline set of capabilities and added 3 key issues which are particularly relevant for the project leader. Firstly, there is developing self-awareness. Secondly, it's about delivering results in appropriate timescales, that is, making the milestones effectively. And then thirdly, creating structure out of chaos, getting a plan, putting that plan into action, and controlling the project development. These 3 aspects of leadership are particularly relevant to project environment, with the close working relationships and quality cost time pressures that tend to be involved. So let's think about these 10 core leadership capabilities in our study questions. If you assign a mark out of 10 for your assessment of your ability at each of the 10 issues in the slide, what mark out of 100 do you achieve? Which 3 issues, if you focused on developing your ability in those areas, would make the most significant positive impact on your performance as a project leader and manager? Now let's look at the practical impact of leadership style in slide 11. And there are many ways we can describe leadership style. John Adair, with his functional leadership approach, taking care of the needs of the task of creating the team and taking account of the attributes of individuals within the team, would argue that style is determined where the emphasis is in the project team. Is it on the task, the team, or on individuals? The international approach, based on the American research of the Ohio and State Universities in Michigan, would suggest that leadership style is determined by the mix of task and relationship behavior on the part of the leader. See the Leadership in Action program, which is associated with this current module, for more details of this approach. We can identify leaders who are high on task behavior and low on relationship behavior, and various combinations of strengths of those two types of behavior. This would propose a wide range of styles dependent on the mix of task and relationship behaviors. Daniel Goleman, in the article in the Harvard Business Review, Leadership That Gets Results, identifies 6 styles of leadership: authoritative, or what he really means is vision-based; affiliative and cross-functional; coaching; democratic or inclusive; and then there's coercive and pace-setting styles. Goleman's work suggested that the coercive and pace-setting styles tend to produce a negative impact on the working atmosphere or climate, particularly in a project team. Vision-based leadership style seems to be the most successful style in terms of motivating people. Finally, autocratic people tend to tell people what to do in the way of giving them orders. Democratic leaders involve their people but reserve the right to make the final decision, and laissez-faire or covert leaders immerse themselves in the group and steer the group decision-making process in a subtle and non-obvious way. So, let's think about some study questions that relate to this practical impact of leadership style, particularly in the project situation. Where do you place your emphasis on the important issues with the work of the team which is involved with the project? On the task, creating the team, or working with individuals? Would you describe yourself as a task-orientated leader or a relationship-orientated leader? Which of Goleman's 6 styles of leadership do you tend to use most frequently? In terms of communication style, would you describe yourself as autocratic, democratic, or laissez-faire / covert most of the time? Just give some thought to those questions before moving on. Finally, to finish off this session, let's think about the subject of success and how we can promote a culture of success in the project team. The subject of success in project working and in life itself is a complex one. However, it is useful to identify the characteristics of those individuals who do seem to attract success in whatever they do. And in recent years, attention has fallen to what has become to be called the secret of human success, understanding that you become what you think about. Now, one psychologist, Dr. Patrick Jordan, has distilled over 300 books on success psychology and produced 5 key principles which we can apply to project working. Firstly, individuals need to take responsibility for their part of the work. They need to act as owners. Shifting from blame frame to outcome frame when problems occur is a key indicator for a successful team culture. Secondly, it's important to focus on positive issues rather than negative ones, on the basis that we tend to manifest that which we think about. Thirdly, the concept of goal setting is very important in project working, and it shows itself through milestones and their timely achievement. Work does not always proceed smoothly, and we all have challenges along the way. Persevering intelligently through the difficult times is important in terms of maintaining momentum. And then finally, none of us is an island. We are gregarious individuals deep down, and it's vital to develop one's networks both in business and in personal terms. Now that's the end of this session on project leadership and management. Take a little time to give some thought to the study questions below and to review the bibliography on the next slide. Our study questions for this slide are as follows. Firstly, do you feel you have a success mindset in that you focus on what you want rather than what you want to avoid? Secondly, how well do you shape up on the 5 characteristics of taking responsibility, being positive, setting goals, persevering intelligently, and building your network? So just before we close for today, give some thoughts for those particular study questions and then review the slide that covers the bibliography. And now to finish off, slide 13, a few words about the references and the bibliography. The first reference, the book Project Leadership by Brian Geddes and Hastings, is an excellent book bringing project leadership up to date. Although it was written in 1990, it still makes the mark on what is important in terms of project leadership, particularly when the content is taken into account with the other references we're giving. Secondly, do a Google search on project management, see what comes up. John Adair's little book Effective Leadership, very, very effective at explaining his functional and action-centered leadership approach. The article by Daniel Goleman of Leadership That Gets Results in the Harvard Business Review is a very good article, and it's particularly useful because it actually has some fairly hard data to support the idea that the intuitive approach to leadership of coercing people and pace setting actually produces a negative climate. What really works is the vision, the inclusion, the whole business of involving people, of coaching people and forming links across functions. Warren Bennis's book on becoming a leader is a very good read, particularly about this leader management debate between the two circles. And John Cotter's book, A Force for Change, very good on leadership. And then finally, Patrick Jordan's little book called The Principles of Success. Very, very interesting book, and you can obtain it from the website given in the references. So thank you for listening to this session, session 2. I look forward to speaking with you in session 3. Thanks. Bye.